Harper Audio presents The Laird Takes a Bride, a Penhallow Dynasty novel by Lisa Berne, performed by Elle Newlands. Chapter 1. The Stronghold of Clan Douglas, near Wick Bay, Scotland, 1811. It was Fiona Douglass's 71st wedding. To be precise, it was her 71st time attending a wedding. When you belonged to a large and thriving clan, there were naturally a lot of weddings to go to, and the total number was bound to be high, especially if you weren't a giddy girl any longer, but, to put it politely, a lady of considerable maturity. So, 71 weddings for Fiona. The details had long begun to blur, of course, but there were certain ceremonies that stood out in her mind. Today would be memorable because her youngest sister Rosalind was getting married. 2 years ago, in this very church, a spectacular brawl had erupted at the altar when the bridegroom's twin brother, already roaring drunk, had lunged forward, seized the hapless bride, and tried to carry her off. A wild melee ensued as several other men, also already drunk, had, with joyful shouts, joined in. 45 minutes later, the combatants subdued by brute force, and the bride's veil hastily repaired. The ceremony had proceeded without further incident, the chastened, bloodied twin the very first to warmly shake his brother's hand. It was also in this church that 3 years ago, Fiona had attended the wedding of her younger sister Dallas. 7 years ago, old Mrs. Gibbs, aged 98 and heartily disliked by nearly everyone in the entire clan, had loudly expired just before the vows were spoken. The general agreement was that she'd done it deliberately in a last triumphant bid for attention, and that she was likely chuckling up in heaven, or down below in the other place, because afterwards, as her corpse was being removed, her pet ferret had crawled out from a pocket in her skirt and dashed up the towering headdress of a haughty dowager from Glasgow, from which vantage point it had leaped gracefully onto the shoulder of Fiona's own mother, who had screamed and then fainted, sending the bride into hysterics and several small boys into paroxysms of noisy laughter, thereby provoking Fiona's father, the mighty chieftain of Clan Douglas, into a fury so awful that the wedding was quietly called off, and no one dared to partake of the gargantuan feast laid out in the great hall, resulting, of course, in a great deal of secret rejoicing in the servants' hall for at least 3 days after that. The ferret was never seen again. 8 years ago, it had rained so hard during the wedding of Fiona's cousin Christy that the church had begun to leak in, Fiona had counted, 14 places, and quite a few hats had been ruined. And 9 years ago, 9 years ago Fiona had watched as her younger sister Nairna had married the love of her life. The love of Fiona's life. Fiona had never told Nairna that. She knew that 17-year-old Nairna was madly in love with Logan Munro, and as for Logan, who could fault him for preferring sweet Nairna Douglas, as soft and playful as a kitten, petite and rounded in all the right places, and with masses of dark curls that framed her piquant little face most fetchingly. Who wouldn't prefer Nairna to Fiona, at 18 painfully thin and gawky and oversensitive, who blurted things out and tripped over her own feet? Especially since, at that moment in time, Nairna's dowry had been substantially greater than Fiona's. It all made total sense, even back then. In the darkest period of her devastation, Fiona hadn't been able to summon resentment or hostility toward Nairna, whom she had loved, still loved, with the fierce protective devotion of an oldest sister for her younger siblings. To be sure, there was a secret part of her, a sad and cowardly part, that would have driven her far from home on this lovely summer's day, where she wouldn't be forced to look upon Logan Munro's handsome face. But to this desire she hadn't succumbed. Wild horses couldn't have kept her from attending Rosalind's wedding. She had, though, slid inconspicuously into the very last pew, She did this all.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?